Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Well, hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. It's me, Larson Hicks, your host, with my co-host, Pastor Rich Lusk. How's it going, sir?
Yeah, good to be with you, Larson. It's been a while. We're kind of irregular with this.
True, it's true. But it's good. It's good that we're able to get together today and make it happen. A lot going on in the world. I don't know what day our last episode was recorded on, but I feel like since then we've had like a lot of major national, international developments and all manner of other interesting controversies. So it's kind of there's a lot to cover. I figure today we can just kind of blaze through a variety of topics.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. We can just kind of do a hodgepodge here of different things going on and things we've been thinking about, and just make it as interesting as possible, as interesting as we know how.
Well, yeah, I mean the big thing right now in the news, obviously, is Iran, and what's going on over there. What's your take? I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what my take is in a few years. How's that? I'll let you know what I think about this war maybe in 5 years. And this really gets at a problem is that, what you believe about the war is very much tied into who you trust to give you accurate information about what's happening there. So I'll just throw out a few things. I actually put something that had probably like 12 points that were, I wouldn't call them bullet points because they were all kind of paragraphs, but, just a lot of thoughts about our situation. And I don't stay up on current events day by day. I just kind of check in, every so often to kind of get the big picture of what's going on. So my information is not always up to the minute, but I don't really think that matters a whole lot because a lot of times it takes a bit of time for things to get sorted out anyway. But yeah, so I think several things. On the one hand, you've got people who say that we're fighting this war at Israel's bidding. It doesn't really serve any American national security interests. Iran's not really a threat to us. And so this is another needless and misguided example of military adventurism in the Middle East. And we're really just doing this because Israel sort of forced our hand. And there is some evidence for sure that is the case, that because Israel has been an ally for so long and because we have so many politicians who, for varying reasons, have a rather unique affection for Israel, that we are willing to engage in this on their behalf. But you do have others, and some who I would really respect, and whose opinion I would also trust, who have pointed out that you can justify this war on America First grounds. That in an age of nuclear weapons, what it means to wage a defensive war is different than what it might have meant in other. Typically, you think a defensive war means you get attacked and then you fight back. Obviously, in an age of nuclear weapons, you can't wait for somebody to nuke you before you do something about it. And obviously, Iran did not. I don't think anybody's claiming they actually had a nuclear weapon, but I think it's also pretty clear that they're not going to stop trying to get one. So that does change the calculus a little bit. I don't think, from what I've seen, I don't think that the Trump administration has made a clear America First case for the war. I also, and this would be more important for me as a Christian, I don't think they've made a just war case for what we're doing. That doesn't mean there's not one. It just means it hasn't really been put out there. So I'll just throw a few other things out that I think Christians should think about in terms of how we survey the landscape, the geopolitical landscape today. One, I think it's very obvious we actually don't live in a multipolar world. For all the hype and rhetoric about that, it's clear that America still has far and away the most powerful military. And it's obvious that Hegseth's attempts to drive DEI out of the military and all of that have been very successful, and our military is very good at killing people and blowing things up, which is what militaries are supposed to do. So all of that is that's I'm very, whatever you say about the right or wrong, how you view this morally, whether it's right or wrong, I think it's very clear that America has a very highly trained and skillful military. But the reality is any war is going to get messy, especially if it's a war against a nation with 90 million people. The one other case that has been made for this war is that it's about freeing the Iranian people from tyranny. And I understand that a lot of Iranian Christians have celebrated this, and if that's the case, then good for them. I'm still not sure that it's our duty to do that in this particular circumstance, but it is another, it's another thing that's on the table when it comes to this. And it's also not clear, this is a regime change war. It's not entirely clear that the next regime is going to automatically be better. And I'm sure that, as Trump is, I think, indicated, he will continue to cycle through leaders until he finds one that he likes or that likes him, as the case may be. But, you can always make a bad situation worse. And so that's what we have to hope to avoid here. I also think that if this is the kind of conflict that's going to drag on for some period of time, and if it really is a regime change war, that's the kind of thing I would love to see Congress get involved in, making a declaration of war. It would be great to hear congressmen debate this and hash it out. That's how the constitutional system is supposed to work. Presidents can't undertake limited military operations without a congressional declaration of war. But there's also got to be a limit on that, and it's not clear what that is. Of course, also at this point, Congress is pretty much useless. Congress has proven itself to be the most ineffective branch of government. The judiciary has proven to be the most dangerous because of judicial activism, but Congress is basically worthless at this point, which is sad. They can't, you got a Republican majority that can't pass the SAVE Act. They can't confirm somebody like Jeremy Curl to a second tier cabinet type position, even though he's a good and faithful and wise man. And then you got something like this, if this did have to go to Congress, it would just get bogged down in a quagmire, I'm sure. So, and that's because you have a bunch of men in Congress who are more concerned about getting reelected than doing what's best for the country. You have a lot of people in Congress who are complete idiots. You've got a lot of people in Congress who, obviously have not only do they not have an America First agenda, they're actually serving the agenda of some other nation, in some cases Israel, in some cases maybe Somalia or some other nation. So Congress is a real mess. But in terms of the constitutional issues, I do think that at some point, if this drags on, I think presidents, I think it's like 90 days or something that they can carry out military operations before they need a declaration. But obviously we have violated that kind of thing many times in our history, and probably will do so again, because I don't think this is going to be over quickly. The one other thing I would say is that I think for Trump, in some ways, this is a bit of a frustrating pivot. I know on the one hand, there are people who say, well, Trump's always had Iran on his mind since the hostage crisis in 1979. And okay, fine. And people have said, well, we've really been at war with Iran for 47 years. But if we were, nobody was really talking about it. So that's kind of hard to believe. But I also think for Trump, part of the problem with this is I think it's a big pivot away from his domestic agenda. And it's not that his domestic agenda hasn't accomplished anything worthwhile, but of course, it's just proving to be very hard to do anything here at home. I mentioned the SAVE Act already, which he endorses and I think would be very good to pass, but has gotten bogged down in Congress. Obviously, things with the deportations got pretty messy in places like Minneapolis and Los Angeles, and I think he needs to stand firm on that and continue with the deportations. But the reality is, it's easier to do regime change in Iran than it is in Minneapolis or Los Angeles. So, in some ways, I wonder if Trump is looking for wins. He's looking for victories because we know he likes to win. And so with his domestic agenda getting somewhat bogged down, and I'm not saying that's his fault, but that's just the reality of the situation in a very divided nation. Is he looking for either a distraction from that or somewhere where he could score a relatively easy victory? Not that I think this will be an easy victory, but there's also one other element to this I should mention, and that is, there's always the 4D chess angle. People who think that what's really going on here is, Iran supplies China with a lot of their oil. So this is a way of threatening China, cutting them off. China's been buying from Russia because Russia is sanctioned by Western nations because of their war in Ukraine. And so you attack Iran, you reduce their oil supply, that cuts off China. Then you lift sanctions on Russia, their oil starts to flow to the West again. Is there some kind of, but the problem I would have with that is that, if this is really all about hurting China in some way, I don't expect the Chinese to take that laying down. And that's where you could have a conflict escalate. But that's another thing that's on the table that I think has to be considered. So I don't know your thoughts on that. I spoke for a long time. What's your
Man, I think your take is wise. I like the way you started with, asking me in 5 years. I think that, that has to be the posture of anybody with any degree of wisdom, that none of us are privy to all of the details involved in these decisions. And being a leader is frequently about is about being decisive. I mean, your effectiveness as a leader is hinges on how decisive you can be, and sometimes that means that you don't get to make a super clear, well reasoned decision. But I do think, one thing I'll say is I think that Trump seems to me to be the first American president to act like the hegemonic power in the world, and not be embarrassed or yeah, I guess just embarrassed about being the hegemon. It's like we are the most powerful nation in the world, and we are going to use that power to reshape the world into the kind of in a way that benefits us. I recently listened to a series of lectures by George Grant on the modern era, and he spent a lot of time on Napoleon, and it reminds me a lot of Napoleon. Napoleon was nationalistic. France wasn't a nation before Napoleon. Neither was Germany or a bunch of other nations. And he, had this like agenda of let's do what's best for France. And part of what was best for France was getting a bunch of European nations to start caring about what's best for them, and kind of setting up kind of nationalistic, self-interested governments across Europe. And so I do think there's something to that. I think that another point is, Scripture talks about, when it goes well for the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there shouts of gladness. That kind of idea. And I know, like in our own church, we have a man who's Iranian, and immigrated here. His family immigrated here in the 70s, and I texted him and said, "Hey, how are you feeling about all of this? Is your family okay? Just, I'm sure this is pretty difficult and complicated for you to think through." And he said, "Not really." He said, "Everybody I know, rejoices every time they hear a bomb drop, in Iran." So I'm certain that's not how everybody feels. But it is silly to reduce these things to some single, factor like Israel or oil or whatever. These are complicated things, and timing is a big part of it. Opportunity presents itself. Israel is taking action with or without us, and there's going to be repercussions that affect us. And so anyway, there's, I don't presume to understand the inner workings of those things, but yeah, I think it's definitely something that we have to just kind of wait and see. I think it's clear to me that the leadership in Iran hates America, and anyone who's allied with America or Israel, and it is avowedly, is chanting death to America, and is stockpiling weapons, and is brutal. And so I don't know that history is going to look back and go, man, we wish the Khomeinis had stayed in power, or we wish that Trump, that Netanyahu and Trump had not defanged Iran and put them back decades in their arms, development. I don't know that anybody's going to look back and go, man, I wish they hadn't done that. But yeah, history will tell.
The one thing I would say, and when I wrote about this, that was part of the point that I made, is that the "ask me in a few years" line is one I think we as citizens can use. Our leaders cannot. They need to know right now whether or not this is just, and they need to have a good idea of what the potential outcomes are going to be and what liabilities are involved in this kind of action. And I realize they can't make us privy to everything they know. That's why it comes down in many ways to, do you really trust your political leadership? I do think there's got to be some kind of case made, but they can't make us privy to all the details of the information that they have access to. So you and I can sit here and say, yeah, ask me in 5 years and I'll tell you what I think about this war. Our leaders need to know right now, since they're the ones who have instigated this.
I think it's also, though, I think they could say, ask me in 5 years, in the sense that, given the information we had at the moment we had it and the situation on the ground, we made a decision that we thought was best. And as things develop, as more information comes out, maybe our if we could go back and replay it and do it differently, we probably would, and that's like leadership in any organization. But yeah, they need to have a clear conscience about the decision they made in the moment, and be ready to, I think I've already even heard some statements from Trump almost kind of walking back, some of the rationale, and so I think it's dynamic and evolving, but I heard him say something to the effect that, this is a war from Iran's perspective. This isn't really a war from our perspective. We're not intending to, this is a mission. We're going in to accomplish a certain task, and we're going to get back out. And I hope that's what happens. I hope we're able to do that.
Let me give it to something that is related but a little bit different. I do like, and I think I have a lot of respect for men like Hegseth and Rubio. What's interesting is Rubio was, he was a Tea Party guy who then seemed to sort of betray that cause when he first got into Congress. And then, if I remember right, he was not favorable to Trump, and then obviously became favorable to Trump, which that describes a lot of people, including myself. So, I don't hold those kind of shifts against him. He does seem to have ended up in a better place. People do change and they mature over time. And I was certainly very impressed. As I understand it, he's a devout and practicing and faithful Roman Catholic Christian. The speech he gave at the Charlie Kirk Memorial after Kirk's martyrdom was very impressive, just as far as basically it seemed like an almost off the cuff kind of summary of the gospel that he gave. I was very impressed with that. So I like him. And Hegseth is in our denomination. Now, there are videos floating around of Hegseth from several years back talking about the rebuilding of the third temple and that kind of thing. And so I don't think that Hegseth holds to that kind of, you could call it Christian Zionist dispensational eschatology today. I think that was part of his shift into the Series C, that he became covenantal. And his pastor, Brooks, who was his pastor for a while, Brooks Pottager, who of course knows him well, and who's actually going to the church where Hegseth is attending in Washington, D.C. So they'll be reconnected. Has done a very good job talking about these issues as far as a biblical understanding of modern Israel. So real brief thumbnail sketch. Just want to make a few points. The modern nation state of Israel is the creation of it in 1948 is not the fulfillment of prophecy in any kind of way. Dispensationalists will claim that because they take a literalistic hermeneutic, and they believe that God basically has two peoples and works on two tracks. He's got a heavenly people, the church, and he's got an earthly people, the Jews. And they will take prophecies like of Ezekiel's temple vision in Ezekiel 48 to say that there must be another temple that's going to be built. Or because they take a futurist view of the Olivet Discourse, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple that then stood. But dispensationalists want to project that into the future and say, no, there's going to be a rebuilt temple, and that's the temple that's going to be destroyed. There's dispensationalists, different ways of taking that, but anyway, what I'm getting at is the modern nation state of Israel, while they have had a special relationship with the United States, and you've had politicians like Lindsey Graham or Ted Cruz who have said that we must stand with Israel unconditionally. There's no biblical rationale for that whatsoever. The true Israel is the church. The true Israel, the true sons of Abraham, are those who have the faith of Abraham. Larson, you and I, as believers in Jesus, have been incorporated into the true Israel. We are branches that have been grafted into the tree of Abraham's family, and unbelieving Jewish branches were broken out. and they remain broken out until and unless they repent. And because that does not happen on some kind of wide scale, most Jews in the world today are broken out branches. They're not part of God's people, not part of God's covenant people. And that certainly goes for the nation state of Israel, which interestingly, the modern nation state of Israel is not a Christian state, obviously. It's actually not even a Jewish state in the sense of having the religion of Judaism inform it. It's really a secular, progressive, modern Western state is really what it is, with state provided abortion. It's, Tel Aviv is considered one of the pro-sodomite capitals of the world, right up there with San Francisco. So a lot of things there that are very problematic. So whatever prophecies there are about the future of the Jewish people, if there are any that apply to them, those prophecies can only come to fulfillment when Jews actually turn to Jesus and become Christians and get incorporated into the church, which again is the Israel of God, as Paul puts it in Galatians chapter 6. But I want to add something to that, because I've seen a lot of debates recently over Romans 11. And does Romans 11 promise a future to the Jewish people? And there are many, and we won't go into detail with this. Maybe we can do a future episode that's devoted entirely to this, because I do think it's a big topic. Romans 11 says that Israel has experienced, and of course, Paul's talking about his first century context, Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And then that will provoke the Jews to jealousy, and they will return to the Lord. They will be grafted back in, these broken out branches. They'll come to trust in Jesus. They'll be grafted back in. A couple key things there. He says, broken out branches. He says Israel has experienced a hardening in part and until. So not all Jews were hardened. Some, like Paul himself, were believers in Jesus. In fact, if you read through the book of Acts, you find there are actually thousands of Jews who can to Christian faith. And he also says this is until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So it seems as if what Paul is saying is there will be a mass conversion of Gentiles over the course of time. That's going to provoke Jews to jealousy, and then they will turn back to the Lord themselves. As they see Gentiles experiencing Deuteronomic blessing, they'll be provoked to turn back to the Lord and experience those blessings for themselves. Well, there's a lot of renewed interest in a school of thought of interpretive, a school of interpretive thought called preterism. Now, this has got to be distinguished from hyperpreterism, which says all prophecies in the Bible were fulfilled by 70 AD. But Orthodox preterism just says there are a lot of prophecies in the New Testament that are fulfilled in 70 AD. Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple and what will happen in that generation of Jews then living. And it's about the end of the old covenant. The question is Romans 11 one of those preterist passages? And I've read the exegesis from a lot of scholars who advocate for what I would call a preterist reading of Romans 11, that whatever Paul is talking about is completed in 70 AD. The all Israel will be saved basically refers to conversions that take place amongst the Jewish people up until 70 AD, and then that whole process is over. I can agree with a great deal of the exegesis, the exegetical work that preterists do on Romans 11. I'm thinking, Jim Jordan's written on this, Peter Leithart has written on this, Jeff Myers has written on. There's a number of scholars who've written on this. What I'm not convinced of is I don't think they have shown that process ends in 70 AD with the end of the old covenant. That doesn't seem to factor into what Paul says. He says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, talking about the people who are well, we could just say the Jewish people, people who have some kind of genetic connection with Abraham, even if they don't share his faith. And again, those people after 70 AD don't have some special covenant with God. They're broken out branches. They're not in covenant with God at the present time. But I do think that Paul is looking beyond 70 AD, or he's talking about a process that continues beyond 70 AD in Romans chapter 11. I don't think there's any reason to think that process, and here's one of the reasons I would say that, is Paul does talk, the book of Acts does talk about thousands of Jews who are converted in a first century context. But it's hard for me to think that would be all Israel, the all Israel that is saved that Paul talks about in Romans 11, because there are actually about 4 million Jews in the world, over 4 million Jews in the world in the first century. And to say that thousands of them converted when there are millions of them, to me, does not seem to be, that doesn't seem to satisfy the all Israel will be saved line that Paul has. Over 1 million Jews were killed in the war with Rome that ended in 70 AD, and then another several 100,000 were taken off in slavery. So the bulk of the nation was still hardened in 70 AD. I think what Paul is talking about in Romans 11 is, just as Israel was hardened for the most part and rejected Jesus for the most part, at some point that's going to flip. And Israel is going to be converted for the most part, just like the Gentile nations will be converted for them. I mean, as a postmillennialist, I believe all people groups will ultimately be converted for the most part, because the gospel is spreading, the kingdom's growing to fill the earth, all of that. And then at the Bar Kokhba rebellion in about 135, there were another like 500,000 Jews that rebelled and got killed. And so I would say, I mean, obviously at that point in history, they were still hardened for the most part. And throughout the course of history up to our day, Jews have been hardened for the most part. There's something like 15 or 16 million Jews in the world today, and only about 1 million of them profess Christ. So for the most part, Israel, or I should say the Jewish people, are still hardened. And I think that will someday be reversed. And I think that the Jewish people will, on the whole, be converted, and that it's so. There's a process Paul's talking about, and Paul sees his own ministry as playing a part in this process of Israel's hardening, Gentiles being converted, Jewish people being provoked to jealousy, and then coming to Jesus. But there's no reason to think that process ends in the first century. I think it's still going on today and will continue on until the bulk of Israel is converted, just like I anticipate the bulk of Gentile nations to be converted. And I've got some stuff on that on my blog, and I'll put some more stuff up here soon, because I think that's an interesting issue. There's been a lot of discussion about Jason Staples' work, and I think he's an interesting read, but I think there's also some problems with some things he sets forth. So,
well, I think it's good. I look forward to reading more and hearing more from you on the topic, and I agree it'd be a good one for us to dive deeper into. Maybe to kind of pivot, but make another jump to another topic. I think this whole conversation about Israel and the Jews and sort of our, how should Christians think about them, I think is tied to this bigger impetus culturally for a scapegoat, right? And I think that I think about Epstein, and everything that's going on in the Epstein conversation right now, right? And I think there's this. If you read Rene Girard's work, I mean, I feel like he does such an incredible job of capturing this phenomenon that we haven't.
The scapegoating mechanism.
Yeah, the scapegoating mechanism and how it works in society and how it's always worked in society. And I think in a time, you and I have talked about how we're in this polarized moment in history where there's so much tension and there's so much, fighting and disagreement about everything, that a scapegoat serves to bring a great deal of unity and peace, because we can all rally around a victim. And Girard talks about how Jesus kind of started to unwind the scapegoat mechanism that used to work perfectly. I mean, you would have tension in a society, you'd find a scapegoat, whether it was a prophet that you thought was the source of all your problems, or whether it was a witch, or whether it was a people group. You just killed them. Everyone united around, yeah, that's what the problem is. Let's go kill that person. And then when you kill them, everyone there's this great sense of relief and catharsis, right? And so, Jesus exposed this mechanism. It's the first time in history where we see the story of the scapegoat through the lens of the scapegoat. And it's also the first time in history where you had a truly innocent, truly completely sinless scapegoat. And so ever since Jesus, whenever this play is run, and it's still run constantly to try to scapegoat someone or something and put all of our problems and all of our blame on someone, we as Christians can't help but say, but wait a minute, is that scapegoat really the problem? Is that scapegoat really the source of our sin and what's wrong with our society? I think you see this again with Epstein right now, where there is this mounting desire to put all of the evil that we see in the world today on Epstein from both sides, right? And we want to just, there's no restraint to how ridiculous and absurd and extensive the conspiracy theories about Epstein can get. You know, it's demonic, it's involving CIA, it's involving, you know, Mossad or whatever. It's involving just, you know, and it just gets growing and growing and growing. The claims get more and more crazy and wild. And I think that we have to recognize that while it seems to be manifestly true that Epstein was rotten and filthy and did some awful things, I think the impetus to try to demonize it as much as we possibly can is a way to avoid looking in the mirror. It's a way to avoid saying, could it be true that this is just the kind of wickedness that all men have, and that when you give someone enough power and enough money, that men in that all manner of men will be taken in by this kind of sin and perversion. And it's a way, you know, I was telling my brother the other day that, like, when we talk about Epstein, it's a way to not look at what am I doing in my home with my family in the community I live in to create and contribute to this wickedness that we see this in our culture. And so you've got, you know, people whose daughters are basically wearing, you know, skin tight clothing that's completely inappropriate and disgusting, you know, underage daughters who are sexualized, who are on the internet, you know, decrying the evils of Epstein, and they're completely blind from the way that they themselves are contributing to this problem in our country of sexualizing children, right? And so anyway, the reason why we're talking about Israel again is in large part because of this huge push. There's this unifying, you know, a scapegoat, whether it's a culture or an individual, a scapegoat attracts this odd bedfellows. It brings people together around this conspiracy, this scandal about a particular scapegoat. And but it's a false unity that since Christ especially just has lost its potency. It just doesn't work the way that it used to.
Yeah, so the scapegoat, of course, goes back to the Day of Atonement in the book of Leviticus, where the scapegoat bears the sins of the people. And of course, all of that is fulfilled in Jesus, and it's interesting because it really works in two ways. On the one hand, the Jewish leadership actually thinks that Jesus will be a scapegoat for them. The high priest Caiaphas says it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation. Like putting him to death actually, you know, can diffuse political tensions, and we can preserve our people and our place by putting this man to death. That's part of the conspiracy against Jesus. But what happens is, but if you don't see Jesus as the final scapegoat, then you still go looking for scapegoats. And of course and this is what Gerard traces out so brilliantly, is there's a long history of that. And of course, it's always a disaster because there's only one true scapegoat, and that's Jesus. He takes responsibility for your sins. No one else can. And when you try to blame somebody else or some other group, you know, sometimes pagans tried to blame Christians. Sometimes Christians tried to blame Jews. Some, you know, poor people will scapegoat rich people, and rich people, you know, it creates a never-ending cycle of violence and division and chaos in a society because it doesn't really bring any kind of lasting peace.
Yeah, and there's only so many sacrificial lambs you can offer up. Like I run a business, right? And there's always this temptation, if something's going wrong in my business, there's always this temptation to go to the board and say, it's that person on the team that's the problem. I've fired them. Everything's going to be okay now, right? And you offer up a sacrificial lamb, and it works temporarily. But if I'm doing that every time I meet with my board, every quarter, well, things didn't go well this quarter because of this person, but I've fired them, and so now things will get better. If I do that every quarter, eventually the mechanism stops working. And I think that's what we see politically with the kind of chattering classes online is it's a play that you just keep running over and over, and it seems to keep working. Let's find a scapegoat. Let's obsess about a particular thing or a particular problem, whether it's the woke or the Jews or whatever. And if you can just kind of keep lining up a kind of buffet of never ending scapegoats, you can kind of capture a lot of eyeballs. But I think the Christian impulse needs to always be like that. We look in the mirror, that we start by looking in the mirror.
I think you're right. I think scapegoating today is often an attempt to escape responsibility and blame someone else or make someone else pay for my problems. And so that's why I think a lot of the Jew hate that you see going on today is very problematic, because you have men who are angry, struggling, particularly young men, and they're looking for someone to blame for their problems. And they're susceptible to this narrative that Jews are behind every bad thing that's happened in the West. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody just the other day, and they said, well, when Paul says that the Israelites are hardened in Romans 11, doesn't that mean they are uniquely malevolent? And I said, well, no, there's nothing unique about it, because Paul also says in Ephesians 4 that the Gentiles are hardened. So you can see these things in the New Testament where the Jewish people who have rejected Jesus are, that their sin, their hardness of heart, their blindness, when Moses is read in the synagogues, there's a veil over their hearts. That you see that in the New Testament. But I would point out, do you see what Paul says about Gentiles in the New Testament and the way he characterizes Gentiles? That's people like our ancestors. Okay. Look at Ephesians 4 and what he says about the Gentile way of life, or look at the end of Romans 1, where he describes what happens in Gentile societies. That's us he's talking about. Even when he talks about the Cretans, that all Cretans are liars. I mean, the Cretans were basically Caucasian people. They were Gentiles. So there's no one people group that is uniquely malevolent. People groups are not static. Sometimes they're more righteous or more wicked, depending on what time you're looking at. And there are certainly variations amongst people groups in terms of ability in different areas. But to pick out one people group and say that they are uniquely responsible for, let's just say, all the problems in the world today, to pick out a group that's identified in an ethnic or racial kind of way is very problematic. I think you can pick them out in a religious and ideological way. I mean, you can say that progressives are behind a great deal of what's gone wrong, but they're white progressives, black progressives, Jewish progressives, Gentile progressives.
And also progressivism has taken hold in our country. In our time, when the church is still very prominent and large, right? And so again, like, if any answer that doesn't result in us looking in the mirror and saying, what are we doing? What am I doing? How is my church or my family or my own, role in the world contributing to this? And what do I need to change about what I'm doing? I think just falls short. And I think it's what's unique about the gospel, right? Is to become a Christian, you first need to repent. You first need to acknowledge your own guilt, your own faults. And I just think that's a that's the central message of the gospel. And Christians who spend all of their time pointing fingers and looking outside for answers to what's wrong with the problem are just missing this key, orientation, I think, of Christians.
Can I make a hard pivot?
Yeah, please.
Okay, let me talk. We got time for one more thing. It's kind of a hodgepodge episode. We got this episode is kind of like a Twitter feed. It's like just a number of different topics that we're pressing into, and not necessarily with a lot of depth, but just jumping from one thing to the next. This is something really interesting. There's a Nikola Tesla quote about feminism that I came across like over a decade ago, and I've used it on various occasions. And I was actually in Austin doing a conference last week, and that's Tesla headquarters now. Got me. It kind of jogged my memory. I was actually speaking on Men and Women, and I was going to use the quote there, but I ran out of time, so I didn't get to share it. So I just put it up on Twitter. Well, it got like 100,000 views and lots of discussion. And I didn't really look at all the discussion it generated, but a very interesting quote. But it got me thinking, Tesla made this quote. Of course, he was famous as an inventor, and he was kind of a quirky guy. I certainly wouldn't hold him up as a model in terms of his personal life. He apparently had some kind of weird affection for pigeons by the end of his life. And the quotation that I put out was actually from an article where he's explaining why he never married. But it got me to thinking, how is it that certain people, like say a Nikola Tesla in 1924, can see the future so clearly? I'm not talking about a prophet where God reveals something. I'm just talking about somebody who with wisdom and insight is able to connect dots and detect trajectories and gauge where things are going, and they can see where ideas will lead over time. And so they're able to look at what's happening right now and project that into the future and understand what's going to happen when this particular idea works itself out to greater consistency in society. And it just got me thinking, I've posted before about A.A. Hodge and the way that he saw where American public education would lead. And he saw this back in the 1880s. He saw that by adopting basically a religiously neutral approach to government education, that it would lead straight to nihilism in the classroom. And of course, he was exactly right about that. His predictions in the 1880s about what would happen with American government education were incredibly prescient, full of foresight. I mean, he saw exactly where things were headed. And what's sad is, of course, he could see that in the 1880s. We're living in the 2020s. You've still got Christian people who can't see the problems with supposedly religiously neutral public education in our day. And he could see it, 100 and almost 150 years ago. But on the issue of feminism, it got me to thinking, R.L. Dabney, even a generation before Tesla, made a number of predictions about, he saw feminism in its most nascent form. People talk about different waves of feminism. And so this would have been like the very beginnings of first wave feminism, the beginnings of the suffragist movement, which was about a lot more than just gaining for women the right to vote. It was really about revolutionizing the way the sexes relate to one another and moving from a household-based society to the individual as the fundamental unit of society. And Dabney in the 1870s was already starting to see this. So what's interesting, and I've got a post up on this, men like Dabney in the late 19th century, men like Nikola Tesla in the early 20th century predicted the world that we live in today. And so we should pay attention to what they say. This is something Dabney wrote in 1871. He was explaining how this rising feminist movement, this women's rights movement, would end up feminizing men and masculinizing women. And in the process, it would kill attraction between the sexes because it would kill sexual polarity, and therefore it would undermine marriage. Okay, so now you think we live in a time where there are record low marriage rates, and you think, wow, Dabney in 1870 saw this coming. This is what Dabney said. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll just read a part of it. So this is talking about women who especially want to enter into public life and into political life. He says, it must follow by this cause, for if no other, that the unsexed, so that's kind of androgynous or like a unisex view of things where men and women are viewed as interchangeable, as just the same. The unsexed political woman can never inspire in man that true affection on which marriage should be founded. So these women who are masculinized by entering public life are no longer going to inspire true affection from men, and it's the man's draw to the feminine that makes the marriage bond so powerful, that binds men and women together. Again, that's sexual polarity. The masculine's drawn to the feminine to the masculine, and that binds man and woman together. He says, as soon as we start to masculinize women by sending them out into public life, that's going to weaken the bond between men and women, the bond that holds them together. He says, men will still doubtless be sensual, so they'll still have a desire for the feminine, but it is simply impossible that they can desire them for the pure and sacred sphere of the wife. So they're not going to look at women as potential wives anymore. Let every woman ask herself, and here he flips it around, will she choose for the Lord of her affections an unsexed, effeminate man? No more can man be drawn to the masculine woman. The mutual attraction of the two complementary halves is gone forever. So he saw what's going to happen when you masculinize women and you feminize men is women are not going to like those men and men are not going to like those women. And the sexual polarity that throughout the history of the world has generated attraction and bonded the sexes together is going to weaken. And of course, that's exactly what we see in our day, where we not only have we have a marriage crisis, we also have what's been called a dating recession or a dating crisis, where young people aren't even dating anymore. And I know, you and I in the Series C, we live in a small Christian bubble where the old ways are still upheld. And we tend to have communities that have a lot of sexual polarity because we still talk about masculinity and femininity. And we talk about the differences between men and women. But in the culture as a whole, that's no longer happening. That was Dabney in 1871. In another place, he said that, and this is, just think about making predictions. This is in 1888. He says, if the Jacobin theory, that is the egalitarian theory, the view that men and women are interchangeable, if that theory be true, then women must be allowed access to every male vocation, including government and war, if she wishes. So in 1888, Dabney is saying, if we go down this egalitarian pathway, you're going to have women soldiers. You're going to have women in the military. And of course, what did we do? Exactly that. She will have absolute freedom from her husband in the marriage relation, as she enjoyed before her union to him, which is basically no-fault divorce. We got that as well. And two, has absolute control of her own property and earnings as that claimed by the single gentleman as against her own husband. So he's talking about, basically what he's saying here is you're going to make a true union of the sexes impossible because you're going to end up redefining marriage to accommodate this new feminist woman. In another place, and this is actually further back, this is in 1867, he says, when America has had a generation of women who are politicians instead of mothers, how fundamental must be the destruction of society and how distant and difficult must be the remedy. So when women leave motherhood to enter public life, and here he's talking specifically about political life, it's going to be a disaster for society. Well, again, we've seen that bear out, and that was from the 1860s. Now, this is what's interesting. This is Nikola Tesla in 1924, and I won't read all of this, but it's all very interesting. He talks about how he was inspired by very feminine women, and he would even pedestalize them, maybe in a way that was unhealthy. He describes himself as worshiping the very feminine woman. But he says, now that's all past. That kind of woman doesn't exist anymore. He says, now the soft-voiced, gentle woman of my reverent worship has all but vanished. In her place has come the woman who thinks that her chief success in life lies on making herself as much as possible like the man in dress, voice, and actions, in sports and achievements of every kind. Again, that's exactly what we've seen. Feminists have said the masculine pattern of life, the male pattern of life, is the norm, and women should conform themselves to it. So women are going to try to do everything men do. They're going to dress more like men. They're going to sound more like men. They're going to act more like men. They're going to try to do sports like men do. They're going to try to achieve like men do in public life. He says, the world has experienced many tragedies, but this, to my mind, is the greatest tragedy of all. Wherein women strive against men and in many cases actually succeed in usurping their place in the professions and in industry. This growing tendency of women to overshadow the masculine is a sign of a deteriorating civilization. So he could see this is the true existential threat to our civilization when we go for a unisex society and men and women are treated as interchangeable pieces. And then I thought this was really interesting, especially because Dabney talks about how men will no longer be inspired by masculinized women to do great things for them and to be tender towards them and all of that. Listen to what Tesla says. Practically all the great achievements of man, so think of all the great things men have done in art and architecture and technology and industry, everything man had accomplished up to the point when he says this in 1924. He says, practically all the great achievements of man until now have been inspired by his love and devotion to woman. Man has aspired to great things because some woman believed in him, because he wished to command her admiration and respect. For these reasons, he has fought for her and risked his life and his all for her time and time again. That's exactly right. Okay. Feminine beauty, and this is biblical. The Apostle Paul calls the woman the glory of the man. Okay. Men are inspired to do great things by feminine glory, by feminine beauty. There's the old saying, civilization is built by men with families to feed. That's true. But we can actually make it more precise. Civilization is built by men who want to impress, protect, and provide specifically for women because they are inspired by a woman's beauty and by her glory. It's Helen's face that launched 1,000 ships. Okay, the woman wasn't inspired to do something great by a man's face, but the man was inspired to do something by a woman's face, by her beauty. A man will gladly, without hesitation, lay down his life for a woman that he finds beautiful and glorious. So Tesla goes on, he says, perhaps the male in society is useless. He basically predicts the whole MGTOW movement, men going their own way, dropping out of the workforce, no longer pursuing women, no longer interested in marriage. That's an epidemic in our day. And here, over 100 years ago, Tesla says, men are going to come to be seen as useless. He says, I am frank to admit that I don't know if women are beginning to feel this way about it, and there is striking evidence at hand that they do, then we are entering upon the cruelest period of the world's history. Okay, well, in a lot of ways, that's where we live right now, a world filled with loneliness, familylessness, fatherlessness. It's a cruel world.
Yeah, I think there's like this, my hope, again, is we're post-millennial, and I have an optimistic hope for the future. I feel like there's this kind of graduating from glory to glory. I've used the example probably on this show before about pornography and how, we are outraged, as we should be, by the proliferation of pornography. But there's also another reality that today, unlike any time in history, men who abstain from pornography are exercising a degree of self-control daily that has probably never been required in the history of the world. And right. And I think in the same way, and I think there's something good about that. Like there's a kind of character and discipline that's developed in that just day-to-day struggle that has never been required before. And I think in the same way, I think there's a judgment when God gives us over to our sin. And I think this describes that very well, this kind of judgment of feminism. But I think the result when this kind of when feminism goes to seed and bears fruit as it's doing, we're living in that time where we're starting to really see the fruit. We're starting to see these plummeting birth rates, and we're starting to see suicide rates amongst men just skyrocketing, and all of these other terrible things. And I think the result is going to be a future where, despite the sort of gains of feminism, suffrage, and everything else, you're going to have a generations of women who choose adherence to biblical femininity in a world where they don't have to, right? And I think that's going to be a kind of femininity that's going to be more potent than we've ever seen. And so I kind of, it's obviously a hope that I have, but I see it. You and I both see it in our churches, women who have the choice, to be feminist and would be nothing but fully supported and empowered if they chose that route, but are choosing instead to pursue biblical femininity. And I think that's something even more potent than just like, primordial or primitive femininity.
That's good. I got to wrap it up. I got to head out.
All right, man. Well, hey, it was great talking, and we'll get another one on the calendar soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Larson.
We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.